Get up. Now. You don't understand English, or you just don't respect it. I am the captain of this aircraft, and I need this seat back. So take your bag and get to the back of this plane, where you belong. Renata Calloway did not move at first. Not because she was afraid, because she was doing the math. I paid for this seat, she said. My name is on the manifest. Captain Grady Holt laughed, and he made sure the whole cabin heard it. Paid? With what, sweetheart? People who look like you don't sit in 1A. You clean 1A after the real passengers get off it. Her hands did not shake. Her jaw did not tighten. She simply reached for the strap of her worn brown tote bag, the one with a cracked leather handle she had never bothered to replace, and she stood. 6 other passengers sat in that first-class cabin. 12 eyes, not one voice. 2 security officers arrived within 90 seconds, radios crackling, and one of them gripped her forearm hard enough to leave 4 red lines across her skin as he steered her toward the back of the aircraft. She did not resist. She let herself be walked, row by row, past people who suddenly found their phones and their magazines fascinating, until she reached row 26, the last row, the one beside the lavatory, and sat down. Then she opened her phone, typed 9 words to a single contact, and hit send. That text message was already moving faster than the aircraft ever would. The private aviation terminal at Meridian Field, just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, smelled like leather conditioner and orchids. The floor was cream marble buffed to a mirror shine. A crystal chandelier hung over the reception desk, and somewhere behind a wall, a pianist played something slow and expensive. Everything in that building was built to say the same sentence without ever using words. You are either someone here, or you are no one at all. At 6:12 that morning, Renata Calloway walked through the automatic doors, carrying that same cracked tote bag, wearing a gray cardigan 2 sizes too big for her, dark jeans, and flat canvas shoes that made almost no sound against the marble. Her reading glasses sat low on her nose. Her braids were pulled back into a simple twist at the base of her neck. She looked like somebody's favorite aunt on her way to visit grandchildren. Not like the 54-year-old woman whose signature was on the title of the aircraft parked at Gate 4. The woman at check-in glanced up, then glanced back down at her monitor. Name, she said flatly, without a greeting. Calloway. Renata. A few keystrokes. The printer spat out a boarding pass. The woman slid it across the counter without meeting her eyes. Gates down the hall. Boarding starts in 15 minutes. A man in a charcoal suit walked up behind her a moment later, and the same woman's face rearranged itself instantly into a wide, practiced smile. Good morning, Mr. Wickham. Right this way, sir. Can I get you a coffee while you wait? Renata noticed. She always noticed. 29 years in this industry had taught her exactly how fast a smile could turn, on and off, depending on who was standing in front of it. At the end of the jet bridge waited a Bombardier Global, $8,081 million of engineering wrapped in pearl white paint, its cabin custom, fitted down to the stitching on the headrests. Renata knew the thread count of those headrests personally, because she had approved the fabric swatch herself on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 years earlier, at a conference table, 2 floors above where she was standing now. She knew the exact species of walnut on the trim panels. She knew the tail number without looking, because she had chosen it herself. November 919 Whiskey Charlie, her father's birthday, September the 19th. Nobody boarding that aircraft that morning had any reason to know that. That was the point. Captain Grady Holt had flown for 15 years, 6 of them in Air Force transport, the rest in private charter. He had a jaw like a cinder block, and a posture that suggested he had never once slouched in his life. He sized up every passenger who came through that cabin door in under 3 seconds, and when Renata had stepped through it that morning, his eyes had done exactly that. Tote bag, flat shoes, no watch, no rings, dark skin. He had already reached his verdict before she said a single word. Now she sat in row 26 between a sleeping businessman and a college student, with headphones clamped over his ears, and she reached down, quietly, and pressed 2 fingers against the marks rising on her forearm. They were already beginning to bruise. 4 faint red lines, turning the color of a plum, left too long in the sun. She did not pull her sleeve down out of shame. She pulled it down because she was not ready to look at it yet. A souvenir, she thought, from a man who had decided her seat assignment mattered less than the color of her skin. From the front of the cabin came the sound of laughter, loud and self-satisfied, and it made something in her jaw tighten in a way the guard's grip on her arm had not. Captain Holt stood at the cabin door, belly pressing against his uniform shirt, his hand extended, like he was greeting a head of state. "Mr. Wickham." "Welcome aboard, sir. Absolute honor to have you." His voice was pitched loud enough to carry to row 26, and Renata understood immediately that this was deliberate. Preston Wickham looked like he had stepped directly out of a magazine advertisement for imported watches. Silver hair, swept back, navy suit tailored so precisely, it looked poured onto him, a tan too even to have come from anywhere but a bottle. 53 years old, real estate. Old money chasing new deals. "Right this way, sir," Holt said. "Seat 1A. Best seat on the whole aircraft." Seat 1A. The seat Renata had been dragged out of 11 minutes earlier. Wickham settled into it like a man returning to something that had always belonged to him. He crossed his legs, adjusted his cufflinks, and within seconds, a flight attendant appeared at his elbow. Not Maya, Diane Wallace, senior cabin crew, blonde hair pinned so tight it looked painful, her smile pinned even tighter. "Champagne, Mr. Wickham? Dom Perignon, if you have it." "Of course, sir." She poured it with both hands, like she was performing a small ceremony. This was the same Diane Wallace who had stood 4 feet away while 2 security officers pulled a woman out of her seat by the arm. The same Diane Wallace who had not blinked. Holt leaned against the cockpit doorframe, arms crossed over his stomach, grinning, and he caught Diane's eye and tilted his head slightly toward the back of the cabin. "Toward row 26, he murmured something low. Diane covered her mouth. They both laughed. Renata saw all of it, the nod, the covered mouth. The laughter aimed at her like a small, precise weapon. A woman in row 4 turned around, glanced at Renata, and quickly faced forward again. A man in row 6 stared at the overhead bin, as though it had suddenly become the most interesting object in North Carolina. The businessman in seat 2C, who had watched the security officers grip her arm without saying a word, was now reading a financial newsletter he had not turned. A single page of "in 10 minutes." Nobody spoke. That was the agreement nobody had ever written down, but everybody in that cabin had signed anyway. When something ugly happens in front of you, you choose comfort over conscience, and you call that choice minding your own business. Renata had spent 28 years building Calloway Aviation Group. 28 years of boardrooms where she was the only black face at the table. 28 years of handshakes that squeezed a little too hard. Voices that talked a little too loud. Eyes that searched the room over her shoulder for somebody more important to address. She was used to it. But being used to something was never the same as being at peace with it. "Ma'am?" A small voice. Renata looked up. Maya Sutton stood in the aisle holding a bottle of water. Mid-20s, dark Zetterkin, her natural hair pulled into a puff, her name badge slightly crooked, her eyes red at the rims. "I brought you some water." "Thank you," Renata said, and something in her voice made Maya linger. "I'm sorry," Maya whispered. "About what happened?" "I tried to say something. I told him your boarding pass was valid. He told me if I opened my mouth again, he'd make sure I never flew for this company again. He said he didn't need 2 of us causing problems on his aircraft. 2 of us." Renata let that sit in the air between them for a moment. "How long have you been flying, Maya?" 11 months. "And has he done this before?" Maya's eyes dropped to the carpet, then rose again. Twice that I've seen. Both times it was. She stopped herself. Both times it was someone who looked like us, Renata said quietly. It was not a question. Maya nodded once, and her hands were shaking as she turned back toward the galley. Renata unscrewed the cap on the water bottle, drank slowly, then reached into her tote phone and pulled out a small leather notebook, its cover cracked along the spine from years of use. No label on the front. She opened it to a blank page and wrote a date at the top. Below the date, a name, Captain Grady Holt. Below that, she began to write details, exact quotes, the guard's grip on her arm, the bruise already darkening on her skin, Diane's laughter, the champagne poured for someone else in her seat, Holt's nod toward the back of the plane. 2 of us, she wrote, and underlined it once. If you think a woman writing quietly in a notebook is the least dramatic thing that could happen on this flight, you have never watched a fire start from a single spark. Nobody noticed until the whole room was burning. 40 minutes into the flight, Captain Holt did something he almost never did midair. He left the cockpit, not for turbulence, not for a mechanical concern. He left because Preston Wickham was exactly the kind of man Grady Holt wanted to be photographed standing beside, and the cockpit had no audience. He squeezed down the first-class aisle, his stomach brushing the armrest of 2C, and planted himself beside seat 1A like a man arriving at a cocktail party. So, Mr. Wickham, what brings you out to Charlotte? Wickham swirled his second glass of champagne. Business. A big one, actually. I'm closing a deal with Calloway Aviation Group. Heard of them? Holt's eyebrows lifted. Calloway? Of course I've heard of them. Biggest private fleet on the East Coast. Corporate charters, aerospace contracts. They're everywhere. Everywhere, Wickham agreed, leaning back. And I'm about to become their exclusive infrastructure partner. Every new hangar, every terminal lounge they build for the next decade, my company is behind it. That's massive. Who runs the place? I've never once seen the CEO in the press. Nobody has. Some recluse. Never gives interviews. Never shows up at industry dinners. Runs the whole operation from somewhere nobody can find her. Wickham chuckled into his glass. Honestly, probably some heiress who inherited the whole thing from daddy and hired good people to hide that fact. You know how it goes. Holt let out a booming laugh. Oh, I know exactly how it goes. These days, anybody with a rich father thinks they built something. Exactly. But the money spends the same either way, right? Wickham raised his glass. Holt mimed clinking an invisible drink against it, and they both laughed again, louder this time. Then Holt leaned in and lowered his voice, though not nearly low enough. Speaking of people who don't belong somewhere, you should have seen the one I had to pull out of your seat this morning. Some woman with a grocery store tote bag trying to sit in 1A like she owned the plane. He snorted. Told security to handle it. Took maybe 30 seconds. In first class? Wickham smirked. What is this, a city bus? That's exactly what I said. My aircraft, my standards. This seat is for people who've actually earned something. From row 26, Renata heard every word. She did not flinch. She did not shift in her seat. She did not even look up from the notebook in her lap. Her face was a mask, perfectly still. Beneath that mask, something was being catalogued. Some heiress, inherited from daddy. A woman with a grocery store tote bag. What is this? A city bus. She thought of her father, Walter Calloway, who had spent 31 years on his knees under aircraft wings at a regional airstrip outside Concord. Grease worked so deep into his fingernails that it never fully washed out, even on Sundays. A man who brought home a mechanic's paycheck and stretched it across rent, groceries, and a daughter's stubborn dream of one day sitting in a cockpit instead of standing beneath one. Walter Calloway died at 58, on a tarmac, in front of a hangar he had serviced for 2 decades, his heart giving out before the ambulance arrived. He never saw his daughter's company reach its first $1 billion in valuation. He never once in his whole life, sat in first class as a passenger. Some heiress. The words landed on her like something spat, but she did not wipe them off. She let them sit. Words like that had a way of becoming evidence, if you were patient enough to let them finish being said. On her laptop screen, half hidden by the seat back in front of her, columns of numbers glowed. Maintenance logs for this exact aircraft. Fuel efficiency reports. Crew scheduling records. Safety compliance audits. She scrolled through them the way a surgeon studies a scan before making the first incision, looking for what was wrong, already fairly certain she would find it. And she did. Panel 6 Charlie, the overhead safety compartment above row 8. A latch that should have been replaced during last month's inspection cycle showed up in the logs as inspected and cleared. But she had heard it rattle when the guards walked her past it, a loose, wrong sound that should not exist on a properly serviced aircraft. Took it. She typed a note and added it to a file already forming in her mind, a file with a name and a date and a growing list of consequences attached to it. Keep that rattling latch in your memory. It is going to matter again before this story is finished, and when it does, it will matter far more than a bruise on somebody's arm. The college student beside her glanced over, his headphones sliding slightly off one ear, and his eyes widened at the spreadsheets glowing on her screen. Fleet tail numbers, route maps, dashboards that had no business being on the laptop of a woman traveling coach in first-class disguise in row 26. He looked at her, looked at the screen, looked at her again. She closed the laptop halfway, just enough to block his view. Just enough to keep her secrets exactly where they belonged for a few minutes longer. From the galley, Maya watched Holt hold court beside Wickham, watched him laugh, slap the armrest, tell some story about a senator he had once flown to a golf tournament in Hilton Head. She watched Diane refill Wickham's glass a third time with a smile she had never once offered the woman in row 26. Then, she looked toward the back of the cabin, toward the woman who had thanked her for a bottle of water when she deserved an apology from the entire crew standing between them. Something was wrong here, in a way Maya could feel before she could name it, the way you feel a storm arriving before the sky changes color. Something about how that woman saw she watched, how she wrote things down, unhurried, in a small brown notebook, not like someone defeated, but like someone who already knew exactly how this story was going to end. 90 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign chimed off, and Preston Wickham stood to stretch his legs, wandering back toward the galley for a second time to compliment Diane on the champagne selection. As he passed row 22, he glanced down and caught Renata's eye by accident. For just a moment, something in her gaze made him pause. Not fear, not resentment. Something closer to recognition, the way you feel when you walk past a painting in a hallway you've walked past 100 times, and one day the light hits it differently, and you finally see what's actually in the frame. He looked away first. He always would later, wish that he had looked a second longer. The aircraft began its descent into Charlotte 40 minutes ahead of the scheduled arrival, cutting smoothly through a bank of low clouds, and the tarmac outside Meridian Field's private terminal came into view, wet from an early rain, gleaming under a sky the color of wrung-out laundry. When the cabin door opened, Wickham stepped off first, the way men like him always stepped off first, his hand already extended toward the man waiting at the base of the stairs. Nolan Briggs, in a dark suit, did not take it. He stood beside a black Suburban with the Calloway Aviation Group crest, stitched discreetly into the door panel, and he looked past Wickham entirely, toward the aircraft door, waiting for someone else. A moment later, Renata stepped out into the gray morning light, cardigan, tote bag, reading glasses, and Nolan's posture changed instantly. Snapping straight, his hand moving to open the car door before she had even reached the bottom of the stairs. He said, "Car's ready whenever you are." The words fell into that tarmac like a dropped glass. Preston Wickham's extended hand hung in the air, a beat too long before he lowered it. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "I'm sorry," he said. "Did you say Calloway, as in Calloway Aviation Group?" A woman stepped forward from beside the terminal doors. Dark suit, a leather folio pressed against her chest, no smile anywhere near her face. Bianca Reyes, General Counsel. Renata Calloway, Founder and Chief Executive Officer. Yes. Wickham's eyes moved from Bianca to Renata, to the cardigan, to the cracked tote bag, to the reading glasses low on her nose. His mind was visibly rewinding, replaying every joke, every laugh, every sip of champagne poured into a seat that had never once belonged to him. "Miss Calloway, I had no idea. I didn't." "You didn't know," Renata said. Her voice carried no heat, no tremor. Just fact laid flat on the concrete between them. "That much is obvious, Mr. Wickham." She turned away from him slowly, deliberately, the way a judge turns from a witness who has already convicted himself with his own testimony, and walked toward Captain Grady Holt, who had not moved from beside the cabin door. Holt's face had gone from red to white, to a gray that belonged on a hospital wall. Sweat beaded along his hairline despite the cool morning air. The stomach that had pressed so confidently against his uniform shirt for the whole flight now seemed to sag, as though something inside him had quietly deflated. Renata stopped 3 feet in front of him. She did not step closer. She did not need to. Captain Holt. His mouth worked. No sound came out at first. Ms. Calloway, I'm going to ask you 3 questions," she said. "I'd like honest answers, though I understand that may be difficult for you at this point." Behind him, Diane Wallace had appeared at the cabin door, her face the color of skim milk, both hands gripping the frame so hard her knuckles had gone white. "Question 1, Renata said, her tone unhurried, the same register she used in boardrooms when a contractor tried to overbill her by 6 figures. "On what basis did you order security to physically remove me from seat 1A and relocate me to the back of this aircraft?" Silence. Holt's eyes darted to Nolan, to Bianca, to the ground crew standing near the fuel truck, looking for anyone to intervene. Nobody did. There was, Mr. Wickham was a priority client, and I made a judgment call based on what, Captain? My boarding pass was valid. My ticket was fully paid. What specific factor led you to conclude that I didn't belong in seat 1A? His jaw clenched. He had no answer that would not finish him, and they both understood it at the exact same moment. Question 2, Renata continued. Are you familiar with Section 14 of the Calloway Aviation Group Passenger Dignity and Anti-Discrimination Policy? Holt blinked. I've reviewed the handbook, yes. Section 14 states that no crew member may relocate, deny service to, or alter the seating assignment of any passenger on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, or perceived economic status. Violation is grounds for immediate suspension and mandatory referral to the FAA. Did you know that, Captain? When you told 2 security officers to grip a woman's arm hard enough to bruise it and drag her to the back of a full aircraft, his silence was its own confession. Question 3, she said, and let the wet morning air carry the full weight of the pause before she finished it. How many times have you done this before? Holt's eyes dropped to the tarmac. His shoulders caved inward. The epaulets he'd smoothed so proudly. All flight now looked like they weighed 50 pounds each. He did not answer. I can answer that, Miss Calloway. Every head on that tarmac turned. Maya Sutton stood at the top of the stairs, her voice shaking but her words landing steady, one after another, like stones set down with great care. In the 11 months I've flown on Captain Holt's crew, I've seen him do this twice before tonight. Both times it was a black passenger. Both times he used a security to remove them from a seat. Both times he handed that seat to someone he decided looked more important. She swallowed hard. Both times I reported it. Both times nothing happened. Bianca Reyes was already writing, a younger attorney beside her, had his tablet out, thumb moving fast across the screen. Renata looked at Maya, really looked at her, and something in her expression softened by exactly 1 degree. Thank you, Maya. That took more courage than most people in your position would have found today. Then she turned back to Holt. Captain Holt, you are suspended from all flight operations, effective this moment. Your credentials will be surrendered before you leave this tarmac, pending a full investigation. She turned to the younger attorney. I want his manifests and every incident report for the last 18 months, every reassignment, every complaint filed, and every complaint that should have been filed and never was. On my desk by 7 tomorrow morning. Yes, ma'am. Renata turned last to Diane Wallace, whose lips had begun to tremble. Miss Wallace, you stood 4 feet away while this happened. You poured champagne into my seat while a man laughed at the woman he'd had dragged out of it. You will be part of the same investigation. Diane nodded once and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would not make it worse. There is one more matter, Renata added, before she turned to leave. Panel 6 Chargely. The overhead latch above row 8 is logged as inspected and cleared. It is not. I heard it rattle when your security officers walked me past it. I want that aircraft grounded until maintenance confirms it in writing. And I want to know how a safety defect made it past an inspection log with your signature on it, Captain, because right now I am having a very hard time believing that was the only corner you were willing to cut on this aircraft. Holt's face went from gray to something closer to ash. Renata adjusted her reading glasses, picked up her tote bag, and walked toward the black Suburban, without looking back once. Behind her, Grady Holt stood alone on the wet tarmac, no passengers left to impress, no cabin left to command, no aircraft left to call his own, because it had never actually been his to begin with. The crew shuttle idled on the far side of the apron, a white van with the Calloway crest on its side panel, usually used to move flight crews between terminals. That morning, it functioned as something closer to a hearse for a career. Holt climbed in alone. Nobody offered to carry his flight bag. The ground crew, the same men who had snapped to attention when he taxied in less than 2 hours earlier, now looked straight through him, like he had already become something transparent. The van pulled away. Through the rear window, Holt watched the Bombardier Global 8000 gleaming under the wet gray sky. His aircraft. Except it had never been his. Every rivet, every stitch, every announcement he had ever made from that cockpit, beginning with the words, "My aircraft had been a lie," he never once realized he's telling, until the exact moment it stopped protecting him. Inside the terminal, Diane Wallace sat alone in a plastic chair outside the crew lounge, her hands folded in her lap, her phone face down on the table beside her. She had not called anyone. She had not texted anyone. She was replaying, over and over, the precise second she could have said something and chose champagne instead. 11 years of a spotless service record, and 1 morning of silence was about to follow her name into every reference check for the rest of her career. The way incident files always do. Meanwhile, on the far side of the terminal, Preston Wickham caught up with Renata just before she reached the Suburban, half jogging in dress shoes across marble that was not built for jogging. "Miss Calloway, please, 5 minutes." She stopped and turned, her expression the same one she had worn in row 26 for the entire flight. Calm, patient, unreadable, Mr. Wickham. I understand this morning was unusual. I want you to know I had absolutely nothing to do with what happened on that aircraft. I boarded. I sat where the crew directed me to sit. Where you were directed, Renata repeated slowly, into my seat. And you didn't ask a single question about whose seat it actually was. You simply sat down. Then you spent an hour and a half telling my captain on my aircraft that the woman who built the company you're trying to partner with was probably some heiress who inherited everything from her father and hired good people to hide that fact. The color drained from Wickham's face in stages, pink to white to something close to gray. My father, Renata said, was an aircraft mechanic. He spent 31 years underneath planes he never once flew as a passenger. He died at 58 on a tarmac from a heart attack in front of a hangar he had serviced for 20 years. He built the only thing I ever inherited, which was the belief that I was allowed to want more than the life he had. And you laughed about that at 39,000 feet, drinking champagne poured into the seat I paid for. Wickham took a step backward, not because Renata had raised her voice. She had not needed to. The infrastructure partnership is off the table, she continued, permanently. My legal team will send formal notice before the end of business today. Ms. Calloway, that contract is worth $62 million. I understand there was a serious misunderstanding this morning, but surely we can. My integrity, she said, is worth considerably more than $62 million, Mr. Wickham. Ms. Reyes will arrange your transportation back to the terminal. We're finished here. She turned, and Nolan opened the car door, and she stepped inside, and the door closed, and the engine started, and the Suburban pulled away across the wet tarmac, leaving Preston Wickham standing alone beside a puddle, reflecting a sky that suddenly looked a great deal less expensive than it had 2 hours earlier. $62 million, gone in under 3 minutes, because he had laughed at the wrong joke, in the wrong seat, on exactly the wrong aircraft. Back inside the terminal, Bianca Reyes sat at a conference table with 2 junior attorneys and a growing stack of personnel files, Grady Holt's records, 18 months of flight logs, and what they found made her reach for her phone before she had even finished the first folder. 16 documented complaints. 16 Black or Latino passengers moved from premium seats without justification over 4 years, across 3 different aircraft. 4 complaints filed by crew members, every single one quietly closed by a regional operations manager who had, in the intervening years, been promoted twice. Had a pattern, not an incident. A system that had been running quietly underneath the company Renata Calloway had spent 28 years building, and nobody above Grady Holt's pay grade had ever bothered to look closely enough to notice. Bianca called Renata from the conference room. Renata answered on the first ring. 16 complaints, Bianca said, all buried. There's also a written complaint from Maya Sutton, filed 5 weeks ago. It was marked resolved with no follow-up documentation whatsoever. Renata was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, fire the regional operations manager today. Refer Captain Holt's full file to the FAA and get Maya Sutton on my calendar for tomorrow morning. What for? A promotion, Renata said, and a program. I want to build something with her, starting this week. Nethakorik. 4 months later, Calloway Aviation Group made the front page of an aviation industry trade publication, not for a new contract, not for a fleet expansion, but for something no charter operator in the country had ever built before. Renata Calloway stood at a podium in the ballroom of a downtown Charlotte hotel. 300 aviation executives seated in front of her. Airline chief executives, FAA officials, union representatives, journalists from 4 countries. Behind her, a screen displayed the Calloway Aviation Group crest beside 4 words, the Every Seat Standard. In the 3rd row, wearing a new charcoal blazer and a name badge reading Director of Passenger Experience, sat Maya Sutton. 4 months earlier, Maya had been a junior flight attendant who could not report a captain's behavior without being threatened with the end of her career. Now, she led a team of 31 trainers rolling out the most comprehensive anti-bias program in private aviation history. Renata had built it from the tarmac up. 6 weeks spent interviewing every crew member across her entire fleet. One question at the center of every conversation. Have you ever watched a passenger get treated differently because of how they looked? The answers filled 4 binders. The Every Seat Standard was not a pamphlet or a 20-minute online quiz. It was a full restructuring, mandatory bias recognition training, twice a year, an anonymous reporting line reviewed by an outside firm, quarterly audits of every seating reassignment across the fleet, and a zero-tolerance policy that actually meant what it said, because everyone in that ballroom now knew exactly what enforcing it looked like. Renata did not say Grady Holt's name from that podium. She did not need to. 4 months ago, she said, a woman boarded one of my own aircraft holding a valid first-class ticket. She was pulled out of her seat by security. She was told, in front of 6 other passengers, that people who looked like her didn't belong there. The reason had nothing to do with her ticket, and everything to do with her skin. Silence settled over the room. Not a polite silence. The particular, uncomfortable silence of an entire industry looking directly into a mirror it had spent decades avoiding. That woman was me, Renata said, and let it sit in the room for a long moment. And if it can happen to the person who owns the aircraft, imagine what it does to the people who can't fire the captain, who can't cancel a $62 million contract on their way out the door. They just sit in row 26, and they carry it with them into the next flight, the next hotel lobby, the next job interview where someone decides, in under 3 seconds, exactly where they belong. In the audience, a woman in the 5th row quietly wiped her eyes. Maya Sutton sat perfectly still, her hands steady in her lap, hands that had not shaken in weeks. The every seat standard, Renata continued, is about building an industry where a 9-year-old girl can climb into a cockpit after the pilots have gone home, look at the instruments, and actually believe that seat could one day be hers. She thought briefly of Grease under her father's fingernails, of 31 years spent beneath aircraft wings, of a heart giving out on a wet tarmac in front of a hangar in Concord. She did not say his name from that podium. She did not need to. She felt him in the room anyway, the way you feel someone standing just behind your shoulder. The applause lasted almost a full minute. Maya was the first to stand. 6 weeks after that, the Federal Aviation Administration formally revoked Grady Holt's pilot certification. 31 documented incidents across 4 years. Once the full investigation closed, he filed no appeal. He never flew commercially again, and the last anyone at Calloway Aviation Group heard. He had taken a job managing a parking structure outside an airport in a different state entirely, a place where nobody recognized his name and nobody called him captain. Diane Wallace resigned before her formal review was even completed. She mailed a handwritten letter to Renata's office 2 weeks later. Renata read it once, filed it, and never responded. Some apologies arrived too late to require an answer, and hers was one of them. Preston Wickham's real estate firm lost 4 separate aviation contracts in the following months. Once word of that tarmac conversation made its way, quietly, and then not so quietly, through an industry that talks to itself constantly. He sold his company 14 months later at a significant loss. But something else happened to Preston Wickham that nobody at Calloway Aviation Group had expected. 6 months after that morning on the tarmac, he requested a meeting, not to salvage a deal this time, because there was no deal left to salvage, but simply to sit across from Renata Calloway in a small conference room with no cameras and no attorneys present. "I've thought about that morning almost every day since it happened," he told her. "I keep hearing myself say it. Some heiress. Trust fund. I said it because it was easier than imagining that a black woman could have built something I would never build in my whole life. And some part of me needed that to be true, so I wouldn't have to look at what I actually believed." He paused for a long time. "I'm not asking you for the contract back. I know that door is closed, and it should be. I just needed you to hear me say, out loud, that I was wrong, and not because it cost me money. Because it cost you something I can't ever give back to you." Renata studied him for a long moment. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Wickham. Most people in your position never do." He nodded, stood, and left without asking for anything else. 2 years later, His name appeared quietly on a donor list for a scholarship fund that trained aircraft mechanics from underserved communities in the Charlotte area. No press release, no photograph, just a name and a number. The way real apologies sometimes look when nobody is watching anymore. Grady Holt never sent a letter. He never called. Some men spend the rest of their lives circling the exact moment they lost everything, without ever once admitting out loud what put them there. But in the parking structure outside that airport, in a different state, on quiet nights when the lot was empty and the planes overhead climbed into a sky, he no longer had a certificate to fly through. He watched them anyway, every single time, and something in his chest tightened that he never had the courage to name. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Renata Calloway boarded a Calloway Aviation Group aircraft at Meridian Field, same terminal, same gate. Gray cardigan, cracked tote bag, reading glasses low on her nose. A new captain stood at the cabin door, young, creased uniform, and he greeted every single passenger by name as they stepped aboard. Everyone, without exception. When Renata reached the door, he smiled. "Good morning, Miss Calloway. Welcome aboard." She walked to seat 1A, sat down, tucked her tote bag beneath the seat in front of her, and reached into her cardigan pocket for a small brass bolt, worn smooth from years of handling. The one thing she had kept from her father's toolbox, the day they cleared out his workshop. She turned it once, fingers, the way she always did before a flight, and then she closed her eyes and let herself feel the engines come alive beneath her. Her engines, her aircraft. Her father's whole life folded quietly into every bolt. If dignity only belongs to the people with enough power to fire the captain, was it ever really dignity to begin with? And when a cabin full of passengers watches something ugly happen and says nothing at all, are they innocent, or is the reason it kept happening for as long as it did? If this story reached something in you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized somebody in it, share it with the person who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me honestly, have you ever been in that cabin? And if you have, which row were you sitting in? I read every single one.